We're going to take a look at the coverage of the refugee story now. Not in Europe, but some 14,000 kilometres away in Australia. The Australian government has a strict policy on refugees, holding them in what it calls processing centres. They look more like prison camps for a bureaucratic waiting game that can last for years. And those camps aren't even in Australia. One is on Manus Island in Papua New Guinea, the other in the Pacific island nation of Nauru. The offshore camps have been called Guantanamo Bay down under. The difference being they're not holding enemy combatants or prisoners of war, just refugees trying to get to Australia by boat. The government in Canberra says its detention system is designed to deter refugees who pay big money to smugglers to get them to Australia. Hundreds have already died at sea making those journeys. The camps are completely off limits to journalists, but news does trickle out. Some of the stories are chilling: torture, sexual abuse, suicides. And the penalties for the whistleblowers feeding those stories to the news media are stiff. However, journalists are still trying to tell the story, and people on the inside are still blowing the whistle. The Listening Post's Meenakshi Ravi now on a news story still shrouded in secrecy in the South Pacific.
The toughest border protection measures ever.
For 4 years now, Australia has been sending a message out to the world.
If you travel by boat without a visa, you will not make Australia home.
An uncompromising message, delivered in multiple languages. The refugees who cannot be turned or towed back are taken into custody. Since the offshore camps, the so-called processing centres on the islands of Manus and Nauru opened in 2012, nearly 2,000 people have been held there, and only 60 have made it out. In those 4 years, not a single journalist has made it in.
There are extraordinary barriers to getting information out about Australia's immigration detention system. I've never been able to get to the Manus Island Detention Centre or the Nauru one, and to be honest, I probably never will. If I even set foot on Nauru, they'd probably arrest me on sight. It has essentially been a media blackout.
Unfortunately, it was not possible for me to get to either centre. It would have been fantastic to get in there to really interrogate some of the claims that are made, to work out the truth. But the reality is that nobody can get to the Nauru Centre. Indeed, these days it would be difficult even to get a visa to get to Nauru at all. In terms of Manus Island, people can get to Papua New Guinea, but the detention centre is absolutely off limits. And the few journalists who have tried to get out there before have been chased away at gunpoint, some have said.
For journalists, getting any access at all to the camps has been impossible.
This is the naval base at Manus.
In 2013, Mark Davis, a reporter for SBS TV, documented his attempts to get into the Manus Island camp.
Look, there's cops. They've seen us come up here, right?
Which turned into a blame game ping-pong match between the bureaucracies of Papua New Guinea and Australia.
I had ministers' staff directly telling me that it wasn't Australia. Australia's an open democracy. It was these troublesome countries of Nauru and Papua New Guinea. Now, I had good contacts in Papua New Guinea, and I soon established that simply was not true. I had the Prime Minister's authority to go there and his good wishes for me to get inside.
I can assure you that you are free to go to Manus anytime you want to.
Ultimately, I had the man who is the head of the processing centre, Papua New Guinea National. He finally consented to me coming into the camp, and here was the ultimate display of Australian power. The Australian guards, on orders from Australian immigration, would not open the gates.
So the Australians are saying they don't want it to happen?
Yes, that's correct.
Now, there is the baldest example of who's keeping people out of those camps, and I saw it firsthand.
The guards always take them down.
The authorities may have managed to keep journalists from getting in, but they cannot prevent information from getting out. Whistleblowers have been crucial in uncovering what goes on in the offshore camps. Camp psychologists, doctors, prison guards have all spoken to reporters about the refugees, about physical abuse, lack of medical treatment, and the mental stress they suffer in the camps. In July 2013, a former security guard told SBS TV that asylum seekers were being systematically raped, with the most vulnerable being particularly preyed upon by guards.
I've never seen human beings so destitute, so helpless. The facility couldn't even serve as a dog kennel. The owners would be jailed.
And just a year ago, a welfare worker on Nauru told a parliamentary committee that security guards were paying asylum seekers for sex and then filming it. Among the Australian government's responses have been a succession of laws and measures aimed at the whistleblowers.
Well, the Australian Federal Police are used as a tool to crack down on whistleblowers by the Australian government. We know that the Australian Federal Police are prepared to use every mechanism available to them in pursuing that. As an example, we found out earlier this year that a Guardian Australia story which revealed that an Australian customs vessel had illegally entered Indonesian waters to turn back an asylum seeker boat. The journalist who wrote that story had a 200-page dossier produced on him by the Australian Federal Police.
The AFP spent hours, days, even weeks attempting to hunt down my sources. And when I requested that information under the Privacy Act, they disclosed hundreds of pages to me about their role in the investigation. What was also disclosed is that the Australian Federal Police had accessed my phone records and my email records in pursuit of my sources. And this was all done without a warrant. Now, even more recently, the government passed the Australian Border Force Act, which contains a separate offence that further criminalises information from whistleblowers and detention workers who speak out.
The Border Force Act was introduced as quite a significant restraint on people who might wish to speak out about what they know offshore. Now, it wasn't the first restraint on whistleblowers or people speaking up. From the very beginning, people working in the offshore centres have had to sign confidentiality agreements. But the Border Force Act, when it was introduced, brought in a whole new level of restraint. What it did was raise the prospect of a jail term, possibly up to 2 years, for anyone who disclosed protected information. Now, what protected information might be, the definition in the law is very broad, and the way the Act is put together, it's quite confusing and convoluted. It's difficult to work out what is and is not a crime.
We contacted the Australian Department for Immigration and Border Control with a list of questions. On why journalists are barred from the camps, they said, ask Papua New Guinea and Nauru. On why the Border Force Act of 2015 criminalizes whistleblowing, they called our question factually wrong, even though the law clearly stipulates prison time for those disclosing so-called protected information. On why the Australian Federal Police were surveilling journalists and their sources, again, they said our question was factually wrong, despite clear documented evidence of police surveillance of journalists. We ran the entire email exchange past our sources, who said our questions were factually correct and that the department's response was typical. Despite a series of disturbing stories, the offshore camps don't seem to harm the ruling Liberal Party's reputation. The Australian mainstream opposition parties on the left and the right also support the detention policy, and conditions in the camps don't look like they're changing anytime soon.
The national conversation around asylum seekers in Australia must seem extremely bizarre looking from a global perspective. We constantly use the word illegals. The immigration minister even said that asylum seekers and refugees were illiterate.
Well, for many people, they won't be numerate or literate in their own language, let alone English.
These are really extraordinary comments, and they do reflect some very deep-seated problems in Australia.
And there's no sense in sugarcoating that. That's the scenario.
These camps have been set up by the Australian government. They operate in the name of the Australian people, and it really is disgraceful that the government attempts to stop the Australian people from finding out what's being done in our names. The reality for these people at the moment, more than 900 people on Manus, more than 500 people on Nauru, is they're serving a life sentence.
The lack of information coming out of the offshore centres has been hugely beneficial for every government. What it does is suppress public opinion. Most people would be outraged, shocked, and definitely driven to demand a change if they were to know the reality of what's happening in these centres, because they stray so far from Australian values and also from international standards of the way humans should be treated. And I think that's the concern, you know, as soon as people offshore become real humans with faces, with names, with stories, it's easy to identify them, we've got sympathy for them, and at that point the public demands something better of the government.
More voices on the download now on the journalistic attempts to get at the refugee story in and around Australia.
So the Australian government controls the entire narrative when it comes to the offshore gulags that we use by dehumanising refugees and by using Orwellian language such that you don't even realise you're talking about people anymore. We actually threaten journalists in our country with 2-year jail terms under the Border Force Act. We bully, we use the Australian Federal Police, like we did with The Guardian, to actually investigate and to try to catch out and prosecute Australian journalists. We have created a climate of terror, intimidation, and silence.